"You filthy piece of trash. You will never be a true part of this family, and that child inside you is going to be nothing but a mistake." My mother-in-law, Jacqueline Stewart, screamed those hateful words at the top of her lungs right before she lunged forward and struck me hard across my pregnant belly in front of 50 stunned guests. The entire room went dead silent. I slowly picked myself up from the hardwood floor, smoothed down my dress, and took a deep breath. With a calmness that surprised even me, I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick white envelope. I handed it to her without saying a word. When she opened it and saw what was inside, all the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. A second later, she collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. But to understand how we reached this boiling point, to understand why a wealthy socialite would assault her pregnant daughter-in-law, and why a single envelope could take her down, we have to go back 3 years to when my life was completely different. My name is Jennifer Adams. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior accountant for a large construction firm here in Chicago. My life has always been defined by simplicity and honesty. I grew up in a home where intellect was valued far above material wealth. My parents are both tenure professors at the University of Chicago. My father, Lincoln Adams, teaches advanced mathematics, and my mother, Caroline, is a professor of philosophy. Welcome to my channel. By the way, I share new stories from real life every single day. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, please subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps me out. Now, let's get back to the story, which I promise will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Growing up, we lived in a comfortable but modest 3-bedroom apartment in Hyde Park, where bookshelves lined every wall and were worth more to us than expensive cars or jewelry. Our family dinners were spent debating literary themes or scientific theories, rather than discussing the stock market or country clubs. I never dreamed of being rich. All I ever wanted was a partner I could talk to about anything. Someone who shared my values and wanted to build a strong, loving family. I thought I had found that person. Jackson Stewart came into my life when I least expected it. We met at a modern art exhibition downtown that I was attending with a girlfriend. He was standing in front of a chaotic abstract painting, debating the artist's use of color with such passion that I couldn't help but eavesdrop. We ended up talking at a nearby coffee shop for hours after the gallery closed. Jackson was an architect at a prestigious firm. He was brilliant, well-read, and had a dry, sarcastic sense of humor that made me laugh until my sides hurt. We dated for almost a year before he really opened up about his mother. He had mentioned her in passing, but I always noticed a strange tightness in his jaw whenever the topic of his family came up. One evening, as we were walking along the path by Lake Michigan, he finally dropped a hint. He told me that his mother was not an easy person. He said she was incredibly demanding and had very specific, rigid ideas about how life should be lived and who was worthy of her time. I didn't think much of it back then. I assumed he just meant she was a strict, principled woman. I had no idea how wrong I was. My first meeting with my future mother-in-law took place at her home. Actually, calling it a home is an understatement. It was a villa. She lived in a massive gated estate in one of the most exclusive suburbs north of the city. As we drove up the winding driveway, past perfectly manicured hedges and a massive stone fountain in the front yard, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. Jackson had never mentioned that his family was this wealthy. Jacqueline Stewart received us in a living room that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place where people actually lived. There were crystal chandeliers, antique furniture that looked too fragile to sit on, and oil paintings in heavy gold frames. Jacqueline herself was a tall, imposing woman in her 50s, with not a hair out of place. She wore a tailored designer suit and looked at me with eyes that were as cold and gray as a winter sky. She looked me up and down as if she were inspecting a piece of discount fruit at the market. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, but laced with an icy undertone that made my skin crawl. She said my name like it was something unpleasant to taste. I extended my hand to greet her, but she barely brushed my fingers with hers before pulling away as if she feared infection. Dinner was an interrogation. She asked where I went to college, and when I named a state university rather than an Ivy League school, she frowned. She asked about my parents, and when I said they were professors, she looked unimpressed. She asked where we lived, and upon hearing about my normal apartment, her lips pressed into a thin, disappointed line. When Jackson left the room to take a business call, she turned to me with a predatory smile. She told me point blank that her son could have had anyone. She said he had a brilliant education and a promising career, and that she always envisioned him with a young woman from their own social circle. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, but I tried to stay calm. I told her that I loved her son and hoped we could find common ground. She just laughed a cold, humorless laugh and said that love was fine, but a family legacy required much more than that. On the drive home, Jackson apologized profusely. He said she was just set in her ways and needed time to adjust. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that if I was just kind and patient, she would warm up to me. But as the months went by, Jacqueline's attitude only grew worse. Every encounter was a torture session. She constantly compared me to Malene Phillips, the daughter of one of her oldest friends who owned a chain of luxury jewelry stores. Malene was Jacqueline's idea of the perfect daughter-in-law. She came from old money, had studied in Paris, and looked like a model. At family dinners, Jacqueline would gush about Malene's recent trips to Europe or her new business ventures, completely ignoring me. She would turn to Jackson and ask if he could imagine how successful a power couple he and Malene would make. It was humiliating. Jackson would try to change the subject, but his mother was relentless. If we ran into Malene at events, Jacqueline would put on a performance praising Malene's elegance while making subtle digs at my job as an accountant, as if earning a living was something to be ashamed of. I eventually learned that Jacqueline owned a chain of high-end medical spas and cosmetic clinics in the city's most expensive districts. The business was incredibly lucrative, and she wore her status like armor. She was on the board of several charities, mostly so her picture would appear in the society pages of the local luxury lifestyle magazines. Despite her efforts to drive a wedge between us, Jackson proposed to me a year and a half later. We were on the rooftop of his office building watching the sunset over the Chicago skyline when he got down on one knee. He told me that I was kind, real, and the only person who made him feel like himself. I said yes without hesitation because I loved him, and I naively thought our love could withstand his mother. When we told Jacqueline, her face twisted in disgust for a split second before she masked it with a fake smile. She dragged Jackson into her study for an hour. I could hear raised voices through the heavy oak door. When he came out, he was pale. He told me she thought it was too soon, but he had stood his ground. The wedding planning, however, turned into a nightmare. She sabotaged everything. We wanted a small, intimate ceremony. She demanded a gala. We booked a charming venue. She pulled strings to cancel our reservation the day before, forcing us to scramble. She even hired her own photographer, who somehow managed to crop me out of half the wedding photos or catch me at unflattering angles. On the day of the wedding, she wore a black dress as if she were attending a funeral. She sat with a stone face all night, refusing to give a toast. For the first few months of our marriage, we lived in my one-bedroom apartment. Jackson wanted to rent a luxury condo, but I insisted we save for a down payment on a house. We were both working hard, saving money, and dreaming of our future. Jacqueline called our home a shoebox. She would drop by unannounced, criticizing everything from our furniture to my cooking. One day, I caught her in our bedroom going through my closet, inspecting the labels on my clothes with a sneer. When I confronted her, she just said she wanted to see the squalor her son was being forced to live in. Then we found out I was pregnant. Jackson and I were over the moon. He became so protective and sweet, buying every parenting book he could find. I thought this news might finally melt Jacqueline's heart. It was her grandchild, after all. I was wrong. When we told her, she looked at me with pure venom. She asked Jackson if he knew what he was doing, bringing a child into that tiny apartment with our mediocre salaries. She spoke about our lives as if we were destitute simply because we weren't multimillionaires. She said she refused to let her grandchild grow up in poverty. I was furious, but I held my tongue for Jackson's sake. As my pregnancy progressed, her abuse escalated. She would buy baby clothes and give them to us at parties, loudly apologizing that they weren't the top-tier designer brands she dreamed of, but she had to match the parents' lifestyle. She invited her high-society friends like Deborah Phillips and Cynthia Evans to dinners just to humiliate me, making jokes about how I had never traveled first class or how I thought a vacation to Florida was exotic. Jackson tried to defend me, but he was no match for her manipulation. She would feign chest pains or anxiety attacks whenever he pushed back, popping pills and crying about her weak heart until he backed down. He would beg me to just endure it, saying she was just struggling to let go. But I was reaching my limit. The breaking point came when I was 6 months pregnant. Jackson had left his phone on the table at our apartment after his mother had visited. A text message popped up on the screen, and I saw the name Malene Phillips. Curiosity got the better of me, and I read the preview. It was a forwarded message from Jacqueline to Malene. It read, "Do not worry, my dear. This marriage is a sham, and it will not last. Jackson will see his mistake soon, and you must be ready to step in when he leaves her." I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. I didn't cry. I sat by the window and realized that my mother-in-law wasn't just mean, she was actively plotting to destroy my family. I decided then and there that I was done playing the victim. I wouldn't scream or fight. I would be smarter. I would use the one thing she underestimated, my brain. A week later, during a mandatory Sunday dinner at her estate, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I walked past Jacqueline's home office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It was usually locked tight. I didn't plan on doing anything, but something pulled me toward that room. On her massive mahogany desk lay an open leather binder and a laptop. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. I glanced at the documents. It was a financial ledger for one of her main clinics. The accountant in me took over automatically. I scanned the rows of numbers and my pulse quickened. The revenue figures reported on the tax documents next to the ledger did not match the actual income recorded in the internal logs. The difference was massive. I had been auditing construction firms for 10 years. I knew what a second set of books looked like. She was skimming millions and hiding it to evade federal taxes. This wasn't just a mistake. It was systemic fraud. I pulled out my phone and started snapping clear, high-resolution photos of every page I could turn. My hands were shaking, and I felt like my heart was going to beat right out of my chest. The silence of the house felt heavy, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. I managed to photograph the most incriminating evidence, close the binder, and slip out of the room just seconds before I heard footsteps in the hallway. I returned to the table, pale but composed. For the next few weeks, I worked in secret. I studied tax law and met with an old friend of my father, a shark of a tax attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. When I showed him the photos, he let out a low whistle. He confirmed that if these documents were real, Jacqueline Stewart was looking at severe prison time for tax evasion and fraud. I spent my evenings building a case, organizing the evidence, and preparing for the right moment. Jacqueline walked around with her nose in the air, convinced she was untouchable. She thought her money and her connections made her a god. She thought I was just a stupid, simple girl from a small apartment. She didn't realize that while she was busy insulting me, I was busy preparing to take everything away from her. She had no evidence against me, but I had everything I needed to destroy her. Jackson Stewart had no idea what was coming. I simply could not bring myself to tell him. Despite her cruelty and her endless manipulations, he loved his mother with a blind and desperate loyalty that broke my heart to witness. It would have torn him apart to know what I was planning, but I had made a solemn vow to myself. If that woman dared to humiliate me one more time, I would use every piece of ammunition I had gathered. I would burn her world to the ground to protect mine. It was the 7th month of my pregnancy when the invitation arrived. Jacqueline Stewart was hosting a grand reception at her estate. She claimed it was a charity gala, a night for the most influential people in the state to open their checkbooks for a good cause. She insisted that the entire family be present to present a united front. I did not want to go. I felt heavy and perpetually exhausted. My belly was large and tight, and my feet were swollen and aching. But Jackson pleaded with me. He looked at me with those puppy dog eyes and said, "Please, Jennifer, it is important to Mom." He was so naive. He truly believed she was trying to mend bridges. He still held on to the childish hope that she would change. The Stewart Villa was overflowing with guests. It was a who is who of high society featuring business tycoons, local politicians, and minor celebrities. Jacqueline was in her element. She floated through the room, beaming as she accepted compliments, and showed off her wealth like a peacock, displaying its feathers. I sat in a quiet corner, feeling completely out of place in my simple black maternity dress. Every other woman there seemed to be draped in designer evening gowns, dripping with diamonds, and wearing flawless makeup that cost more than my first car. An hour into the reception, Jacqueline finally descended upon me. She was flanked by 3 of her closest friends, women who were just as manicured and arrogant as she was. Jennifer, my dear, her voice was sweet like molasses, but I had learned to taste the arsenic hidden beneath the sugar. Let me introduce you. These are my dearest friends, Deborah, Cynthia, and Donna. Ladies, this is my son's wife. The women looked me up and down as if I were a stain on the expensive Persian rug. I struggled to stand up, feeling the muscles in my lower back seize from sitting too long. "It is a pleasure to meet you," I said. I extended my hand, but not a single one of them offered theirs in return. "Jacqueline has told us so much about you," one of the ladies said, eyeing me with barely concealed curiosity. She mentioned, "You come from very humble beginnings." "My parents are university professors," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the heat rising in my cheeks. "Oh, how noble," another one cooped with fake admiration. "So few people choose intellectual professions. These days, though naturally, it is not exactly a lucrative field, is it?" Jacqueline smiled, clearly basking in my discomfort. "Jennifer is an accountant," she added quickly, "at some construction firm. Jackson could support the family entirely on his own, of course, but Jennifer insists on working. She is so independent." There was so much sarcasm dripping from the word independent that even the guests at the nearby tables glanced over. "I think it is important for a woman to have her own income and not be solely dependent on a husband," I said, trying to maintain my composure. Of course," Jacqueline said, waving her hand dismissively. "Although, ladies, I must admit I always thought Jackson would marry someone from our own circle. I had such a wonderful candidate in mind, Malene Phillips, Deborah's daughter. Do you remember, Deborah, how beautiful they looked together at the Winter Gala 3 years ago?" "Oh, yes," Deborah chimed in immediately. "Malene is still single, by the way. Such a beauty, such bright prospects. And yet, she waits." I felt anger boiling in my veins, hot and acidic, but I remained silent. I clenched my fists at my side so hard that my fingernails dug into my palms. "But what can you do?" Jacqueline sighed theatrically. Youth, lust, hormones. Jackson simply would not listen to me. Now they live in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment, pinching every penny and expecting a child. I just hope the grandchild will at least be healthy, though with genes like that. She did not finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a foul smell. Something inside me finally snapped. It was the sound of my patience shattering. "Mrs. Stewart," my voice was low, but it carried a steel weight. "I understand that you consider me unworthy. You made that perfectly clear from the moment we met. But I am asking you to stop insulting my unborn child." "Insulting?" She feigned shock, placing a hand over her chest. "I am merely expressing my concern. After all, children often inherit not only their parents' appearance but also their limitations and their social standing." The chatter around us died down. The silence spread outward like a ripple until the guests nearby stopped drinking and turned to watch. Jackson, who had been talking to some investors across the hall, noticed the shift in the atmosphere. He started walking toward us, his brow furrowed. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked as he reached us, looking between my pale face and his mother's tense expression. "I am speaking with your wife about reality, Jackson. About the fact that a child born into poverty by a mother of questionable background will hardly achieve much in life. It is just statistics. Jacqueline, stop it immediately." Jackson raised his voice and heads turned from every corner of the room. But Jacqueline Stewart could not stop. The contempt she had suppressed for years came pouring out like a broken dam. "You married a social parasite, Jackson. She and her clan are clinging to you for your money, for your connections, for your status. You are too blind to see it. And now she is going to birth a child who will be just as much of a failure as she is." The hall froze. Everyone was staring at us. I felt my hands trembling, my throat constricting with a mix of rage and deep hurt. Jacqueline took a step toward me. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly wrath. "You filth! You will never be part of this family, and your child will be nothing." She pulled her arm back, and before anyone could react, she struck me. It wasn't a slap to the face. She swung her fist and hit me directly in the stomach. A sharp, piercing pain shot through me. I gasped, doubling over, clutching my belly as I sank to the floor. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Someone screamed. Jackson lunged toward me, but adrenaline surged through my veins. I was already pushing myself up, gripping the edge of a table for support. Slowly, very slowly, I straightened my spine. I looked at my mother-in-law. She was standing there breathing heavily, her face flushed with adrenaline. And then, with a calm that terrified even me, I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out the envelope. It was the envelope I had been carrying for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. I handed it to Jacqueline Stewart. "This is for you." My voice was cold and hollow. "I think the content will interest you." She snatched the envelope from my hand, tore it open, and pulled out the documents. As she began to read, I watched the color drain from her face. Her eyes went wide, and the hands holding the papers began to shake violently. They were copies of official Internal Revenue Service notifications regarding a full audit of her studios, copies of the report filed with the district attorney regarding suspicion of tax evasion in the first degree, and copies of the photos I had taken of the doctored ledgers in her private study. Jacqueline looked up at me. In her eyes, I saw shock, horror, and for the first time, fear. "You," she whispered, "how dare you?" But she never finished the thought. She swayed on her feet, the document slipping from her fingers and scattering across the polished floor like autumn leaves. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed in a dead faint. Panic erupted in the hall. People were shouting. Someone was calling 911. Her friends Deborah and the others were fluttering around her prone body like useless birds. Jackson looked at me with total confusion in his eyes. But I stood there like a statue, my hand protectively over my stomach where his mother had just struck me. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was the one in control. The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. The paramedics revived Jacqueline, checking her blood pressure and pulse. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she did was look for me. There was such pure, unadulterated hatred in her gaze that it made my skin crawl. She tried to croak out a word, pointing a shaking finger at me, but the paramedics held her down and sedated her. The guests began to disperse, whispering frantically among themselves. The charity gala had turned into the scandal of the decade, something the entire city would be talking about by morning. Jackson took my hand. "We have to go now." We left the villa under the stunned gazes of the remaining staff. In the car, the silence was suffocating. Jackson drove, gripping the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles were white. "What was that, Jennifer?" he finally asked when we were miles away from the estate. "What kind of documents did you give her?" I took a deep breath. I knew this conversation was inevitable. "Your mother keeps a double set of books for her studios, Jackson. She has been evading millions in taxes. I found the documents by accident 2 months ago when I was at her house. I gathered evidence and I filed a report with the IRS and the fraud division." The car broke abruptly. Jackson pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, killed the engine, and turned to face me. "What did you do?" His voice trembled. "That is my mother, Jennifer. How could you? How could I?" I felt a wave of anger rising up to me to shock. "Jackson, your mother just punched me in the stomach." "Me? Your wife? Who is 7 months pregnant?" She called me a parasite in front of 50 people. She said our child would be a genetic failure. "And you were asking me how I could go to the authorities." "But filing a report?" Jackson stammered. "Jennifer, that is a crime. She could go to prison?" "Yes, it is a crime." I raised my voice. "Her crime? She has been breaking the law for years, cheating the government, hiding money, and I simply provided the evidence to law enforcement. That is my duty as a citizen. That is revenge," he said quietly. "That is justice." I shot back, and it is self-defense. "Jackson, I have endured this for 3 years. I took the humiliation, the insults, the disdain. I stayed silent when she compared me to ex-girlfriends, when she tried to ruin our wedding, when she called our home a dog kennel. I swallowed all of it for you and for our marriage. But the moment she came after my child, our child, I had every right to strike back." Jackson fell silent, staring out the windshield at the dark highway. I saw the muscles in his jaw working. "You should have told me." "And what would you have done?" I asked softly. "You would have asked me not to destroy your relationship with your mother. You would have begged me to give her another chance." "Jackson, you have been giving her chances your entire life, and she still treats people like dirt." He turned sharply to face me. "She is my mother and I am your wife," I said, placing a hand on my belly. "And this is your child. Who do you choose, Jackson? The woman who just physically assaulted your pregnant wife or your own family?" The silence stretched out, heavy and painful. I watched him struggle, torn between his duty as a son and his duty as a husband and father. Finally, he let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Let's go home." We drove the rest of the way in silence. Once we were inside the apartment, Jackson went straight to the shower. I sat on the sofa, feeling the tremors in my hands as the adrenaline faded. I checked my phone. There were over 20 missed calls, all from Jacqueline and her relatives. I silenced the device. When Jackson came out, he looked drained, as if he had aged 10 years in one night. He sat beside me and stayed quiet for a long time. "I need time to process this," he said finally. "It is too much. I never expected it to end like this." "I understand," I answered. "But know this, I do not regret a single thing I did. And if I had to choose again, I would do exactly the same thing. Protecting this family from toxicity is the right thing to do." That night, we lay on opposite sides of the bed. I could not sleep for hours, replaying the events in my mind. My hand rested on my belly, and I felt the baby kick against my palm. "Everything will be okay," I whispered into the darkness. "I will protect you from everyone." In the morning, my mother called. It turned out that one of the guests at the reception knew my parents from the university and had already spilled the details of the scandal. "Jennifer, what happened?" Mom's voice sounded frantic. I told her everything. Every insult, the punch, the envelope. My mother listened in silence, only gasping occasionally. "My daughter," she said when I finished, her voice fierce. "You did the right thing. No one has the right to strike a pregnant woman. No one. And gathering evidence of her crimes isn't revenge. It is upholding the law. Let Jackson think. He needs to understand that his mother brought this on herself." Talking to my mother calmed me down. My father, Lincoln, got on the line and told me he was proud of me. "You showed character, Jennifer. Not every woman has the strength to stand up for herself like that." 3 days later, the police arrived at the estate. It was 2 detectives and a team of federal agents with a search warrant for Jacqueline Stewart's villa. Jackson was at work, and I didn't call him. I knew he was suffering enough. The investigators were polite, but ruthless. They seized Jacqueline's computers, boxes of files, USB drives, and even her personal notebooks. The entire raid was filmed for evidence. Jacqueline sat on the silk sofa in her living room, pale and trembling, looking like she had aged 20 years since the party. When the agents left, she called Jackson. I listened to the conversation because he put it on speakerphone. "Jackson, my son, I need your help." Her voice was whining and pathetic, completely different from the imperious tone I knew so well. "It is all your wife. She set me up. It is all lies. A provocation. I need a top-tier criminal defense attorney. I need money to pay the retainer." "Mom, I can't," Jackson said, his voice straining. "What do you mean you can't?" she shrieked. "I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you. I gave you everything." "Mom, you punched my pregnant wife. You screamed at her in front of everyone. And you actually broke the law. That is your choice. That is your responsibility, Jackson." Her voice pitched up into hysteria. "You are choosing that cheap substitute over your own mother." "I am choosing my family," Jackson said, tears standing in his eyes. "And I am asking you not to call me anymore." He hung up. I saw his hands shaking, his jaw clenched tight to keep from sobbing. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him. Jackson pulled me close, burying his face in my neck. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for not protecting you sooner. Forgive me for being weak. You are not weak," I whispered back, stroking his hair. You just love your mother. That is normal. But sometimes love means letting someone face the consequences of their actions. The following weeks were a nightmare. Jackson's extended family bombarded us with calls and hateful messages. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins. Everyone demanded that I retract my statement, accusing me of destroying the family, calling me a traitor. Jacqueline's sister, Christina Cook, was particularly vicious. She showed up at our apartment building one evening, hammering her fists against our front door. She didn't care who hurt her. "Come out, you little snake!" Christina screamed through the wood, her voice echoing in the hallway. "You ruined your mother-in-law's life. How do you sleep at night knowing what you've done?" I stood in the living room staring at the vibrating door, and I did not op. I finally had to call the police on Christina. The pounding on our door and the screaming had gone on for nearly 20 minutes, and I wasn't going to risk my safety or the safety of my unborn child any longer. Once the officers arrived and filed a report for harassment, the physical visit stopped abruptly, but the war didn't end there. It just moved to a battlefield I couldn't easily block out. A smear campaign ignited online that was so vicious it took my breath away. Someone from Jackson's extended family posted my photo on Facebook and Instagram with a caption that read, "This woman called the cops on her own grieving mother-in-law." The comment section turned into a cesspool. Strangers who knew nothing about us were calling me a gold digger, a snake, and cruel beyond measure. Of course, a few people defended me, but the sheer volume of hate was overwhelming. Jackson couldn't take it anymore. He deleted every social media account he had. I locked mine down to the highest privacy settings, effectively scrubbing my digital footprint. We retreated into our apartment like it was a bunker, trying to preserve a tiny island of peace in a sea of chaos. My health became my only priority. After Jacqueline had punched me in the stomach at the gala, I was consumed by a paralyzing fear that she had hurt the baby. I went to the obstetrician weekly needing that reassurance. Every time the doctor put the wand on my belly and the room filled with the rhythmic whoosh whoosh of the heartbeat, I would burst into tears. The doctor kept telling me that the baby was fine, developing perfectly on schedule. But her advice was always the same. "You need rest, Jennifer. You have to avoid stress." It was ironic advice considering my mother-in-law was the target of a massive federal investigation and I was the star witness. About a month after the raid on her mansion, Jacqueline Stewart was officially summoned for interrogation. She brought her high-priced legal team, but it didn't matter. The forensic accountants had done their job too well. It turned out Jacqueline's empire was built on quicksand. The fraud went deeper than just hiding a few receipts. She had been paying her salon staff under the table to avoid payroll taxes, keeping 2 sets of books, and using shell companies and straw men to hide real estate assets. The estimated damage to the IRS and state revenue services was over $25 million. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated decades-long criminal enterprise. The judge slapped her with a travel ban immediately, seizing her passport to ensure she couldn't flee the country. They also froze her personal assets and bank accounts. In our city, news like that travels faster than light. Jacqueline had been a pillar of the local business community, a woman who sat on charity boards and hosted galas. Now, the newspapers were running headlines about the local beauty mogul's tax evasion scandal. The local news stations ran segments on it every night at 6. They didn't name her officially pending the trial, but everyone knew exactly who it was. The social fallout was brutal. The same society ladies who had sipped champagne at her house, the ones who had turned their noses up at me, suddenly treated Jacqueline like she was radioactive. It was hypocrisy at its finest. They gave statements saying they were shocked and appalled, claiming they always thought she was an honest woman, distancing themselves to protect their own reputations. Desperation set in. Jacqueline tried to reach Jackson through her lawyer, sending messages begging for a sit-down, a chance to explain, a chance to fix things. Jackson refused every single request. He had chosen his side, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He was grieving the mother he wished he had. He stopped sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed cold. One night around 3:10 in the morning, I walked into the kitchen and found him sitting in the dark, staring into a mug of cold tea. "Can't sleep," I whispered, pulling a chair up next to him. "I keep thinking about her," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. He looked at me, his eyes rimmed with red. "She wasn't always like this, Jen. When I was a kid before Dad died, she was different. She was warm. She baked cookies. When my father passed away when I was 12, she was left alone with everything. She built the business from the ground up to survive. I think something inside her broke back then. She became hard. She became obsessed with money and status because she was terrified of losing control again. I reached out and covered his hand with mine, squeezing tight. Jackson, tragedy explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Lots of people lose loved ones. My parents lost their first business years ago and they didn't turn cruel. Your mother made a choice. She chose to break the law. She chose to humiliate people. She decided that her net worth was more important than human dignity. I know, he sighed, rubbing his face. Intellectually, I know that. But she is still my mom. It's confusing to love someone who is toxic. Loving her doesn't mean you have to let her destroy you, I said firmly. And it definitely doesn't mean sacrificing your wife and child to feed her ego. He nodded, and I could see the resolve hardening in his eyes. Even through the pain, as the weeks went on, the investigation turned forward. I was called in for depositions multiple times. I sat in sterile conference rooms and recounted exactly how I found the ledger, what I saw, and how I secured the copies. The federal agents were professional, but Jacqueline's defense attorney was a shark. He tried to paint me as a disgruntled daughter-in-law out for revenge, suggesting I had broken into her private office illegally. Thankfully, my lawyer, an old friend of my father's, shut that down instantly. He argued that I was a guest in the home, a family member with free reign of the house, and upon seeing evidence of a felony, I performed my civic duty. I was a whistleblower, not a burglar. Slowly, my anxiety began to unspool. I realized I had done the right thing. The law was on my side. More importantly, Jackson was on my side. He changed during those months. The boy who used to be afraid of his mother's shadow disappeared, replaced by a man who didn't care what people thought anymore. When he caught colleagues whispering about the scandal at work, he didn't hide. He told them flat out that his mother broke the law and would face the consequences and that he had nothing to hide. That kind of brutal honesty earned him a lot of respect. By my 8th month, I went on maternity leave. We spent our days setting up the nursery in our small apartment. We didn't have the millions Jacqueline had, so we bought a sensible crib and a stroller that was safe and cute, not a designer statement piece. My parents, Lincoln and Caroline, came down to help us get ready. They were over the moon about their granddaughter. We had found out it was a girl during the last ultrasound. Jackson wanted to name her Sophia, and I agreed instantly. It was soft, bright, and full of wisdom. A week before my due date, the district attorney's office called me in one last time to clarify a timeline discrepancy before the trial. Jackson insisted on driving me. He wasn't letting me out of his sight this close to the birth. We were sitting in the waiting area when the door opened and Jacqueline walked out with her attorney. I almost didn't recognize her. In just a few months, she had aged 10 years. Her hair, usually dyed a perfect chestnut, was showing aggressive streaks of gray. Her face was gaunt, the skin hanging loosely around her jaw, and deep dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her designer suit hung on her frame like it was 2 sizes too big. When she looked up and saw us, her eyes locked onto mine. There was no remorse there, only pure, distilled hatred. It was a look so venomous, I instinctively put a protective hand over my baby bump. "Jackson!" she rasped. Her voice was broken, sounding like she had been screaming for days. Jackson stood up, his posture stiff. "Son, please," she begged, taking a step toward him. "You have to help me. You have to talk to her. Make her withdraw the statement. Tell them she was confused. Tell them she made a mistake. I will give you anything. I will do whatever you ask." "Mom, stop," Jackson said, his voice low and final. "It is too late. The case is going to trial." "But she can say she lied." Jacqueline's voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "She can fix this. Mom, you kept 2 sets of books. That is a fact. The feds had the evidence. This isn't a misunderstanding." Jacqueline's face twisted. She tried to lunge past her lawyer toward me. "It's all because of her." She shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "That little piece of trash destroyed my life. I hope you regret this for the rest of your miserable life. Veronica, that is enough. Her lawyer snapped, grabbing her arm and physically restraining her. You are only making this worse. Jackson stepped in front of me, using his body as a shield. Get out of here, Mom. Now. The authority in his voice stunned her. She recoiled, looking at him like he was a stranger before turning on her heel and storming toward the elevators. Her lawyer gave us an apologetic nod and chased after her. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my hands trembling. It's okay, Jackson whispered, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. She can't hurt us anymore. The meeting went quickly, but the stress must have triggered something. 2 days later, well before my due date, I woke up with a sharp twisting pain in my lower back. The contractions hit hard and fast. We rushed to the hospital and Jackson was a rock. He held my hand through 8 hours of grueling labor, wiping sweat from my forehead and whispering encouragement when I thought I couldn't push anymore. When I finally heard that first indignant cry, every ounce of pain vanished. It's a girl, the nurse announced. 7. LB80. 20 in long, Apgar score of 9. She is perfect. They laid her on my chest. This tiny, warm, squirming weight. She had a full head of dark hair and her eyes were squeezed shut against the harsh lights. She was absolute perfection. Sophia, I whispered. Our little Sophia. Jackson was weeping openly, kissing my forehead, my cheeks, my hands. Thank you, he kept saying. Thank you, Jen. When my parents came into the delivery room, my mom burst into tears of joy. My dad, the stoic professor, couldn't take his eyes off his granddaughter. She looked just like you did, my mom said softly. A perfect little angel. I thought back to Jacqueline's curse, how she had screamed that my child would be born wrong, a monster. And yet here she was, healthy, beautiful, surrounded by nothing but love. Jackson decided right then that we wouldn't tell Jacqueline. She didn't deserve to know. Not yet. He didn't want her trying to use Sophia as a bargaining chip in her trial. The trial began when Sophia was just a month old. Since I was breastfeeding, I had to bring her with me to the federal courthouse. My mom came along to sit with the baby in the hallway while I testified. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back benches, pens poised. Jacqueline's few remaining loyal relatives took up the front row, glaring daggers at me as I walked in. I kept my head high and refused to look at them. Jacqueline sat at the defense table. She had pulled herself together, wearing a severe dark suit with her hair pulled back into a tight bun, trying to project dignity, but I could see her hands shaking under the table. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically: tax evasion, wire fraud, falsifying documents. Each count carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years. The witnesses were damning. Former employees testified about receiving cash in envelopes and being ordered to lie to auditors. The IRS agent presented charts showing millions in hidden revenue. Then they called me. I walked to the stand, swore on the Bible, and sat down. The prosecutor was gentle but direct. I explained everything, finding the ledger, the shock of the numbers, the consultation with my attorney. Tell me, Mrs. Stewart, the prosecutor asked, pausing for effect. What was your motivation for going to the authorities? Why turn in your own mother-in-law? I turned my head and looked directly at Jacqueline. I protected my family, I said, my voice steady in the silent courtroom. The defendant had systematically humiliated me and tried to destroy my marriage. But the breaking point was the night she physically assaulted me. She punched me in the stomach when I was 7 months pregnant and cursed my unborn child. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I used the only legal weapon I had to stop a dangerous person. Objection. The defense attorney up. The witness is justifying her actions with personal vendetta. Overruled. The judge said calmly. The witness's motivation does not change the facts of the crime. Continue. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense tried to trap me, asking if I regularly snooped in private offices. I was a guest in the home, I replied. The door was open. The documents were in plain sight. You took photos of private financial papers, he argued. I took photos of evidence of a felony, I countered. As a citizen, I have a duty to report a crime regardless of who commits it. I didn't break. Eventually, the judge dismissed me. I walked out into the hallway where my mom was rocking Sophia. The baby was sleeping peacefully, totally unaware of the battle being fought a few feet away. I picked her up, burying my nose and her soft hair. She was my reward. She was the reason I fought. The trial lasted 3 days. It was a slaughter. The evidence of $25 million in fraud was irrefutable. In the final phase, Jacqueline stood up to make a statement. She tried to salvage her pride. "I admit to making errors in management," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "But I will never forgive the person who destroyed my life out of spite. That woman invaded my family. She bewitched my son. She ruined my name. She plays the hero, but she is a cold, calculating snake." The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Defendant, restrain yourself. Your personal family grievances are irrelevant to these charges. Sit down." Jacqueline collapsed into her chair, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She looked small, she looked defeated, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her at all. The judge retired to chambers for deliberation, leaving a heavy silence hanging over the packed courtroom. We waited for nearly 2 hours, every tick of the clock amplifying the tension in my chest. Jackson held my hand so his knuckles were white. Finally, the bailiff announced the judge's return, and the entire room stood up. The verdict was delivered with a stoic finality that made my knees weak. The defendant, Jacqueline Stewart, was found guilty of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy in the first degree. She was sentenced to 48 months to be served in a minimum security federal correctional facility. Furthermore, she was ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $25 million to the federal government. The judge banged the gavel and declared that all of the defendants' assets would be frozen and liquidated until the debt was fully satisfied. I watched Jacqueline's face. The color drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a wax statue. Her relatives in the back row jumped up and started screaming protests, but the marshals immediately called for order. Her high-priced lawyer leaned in to whisper something to her, but she wasn't listening. She just sat there staring into the void, her empire crumbling into dust around her. I stood up and walked toward the exit, feeling lighter than I had in years. Jackson wrapped his protective arm around my shoulders while my mother pushed the stroller with sleeping Sophia inside. We left the federal courthouse into a blinding storm of camera flashes and shouting journalists. Reporters shoved microphones in our faces, asking if I was satisfied with the verdict, and if I would contact my mother-in-law after her release. They asked if I regretted turning her in. I stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to face the cameras one last time. "Justice has been served," I said clearly into the bank of microphones. "I regret nothing." We kept walking without looking back, leaving the circus behind us. 6 months have passed since that day. Jacqueline was serving her sentence in a federal facility somewhere upstate. Jackson and I tried our best not to think about her, focusing instead on living our own lives and raising our daughter. Sophia was growing into a wonderful child, calm and always smiling with a curiosity that lit up every room. By 5 months old, she was already rolling over, and by 6 months, she could sit up with just a little support. The pediatrician told us her development was excellent, with no delays whatsoever. Every time I looked at her healthy, rosy face, I remembered my mother-in-law's curse, and I smiled. No evil words had any power over our little girl. Jackson and I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburb. We didn't buy it. We were just renting. The rent was a bit high for our budget, but we desperately needed the space. One room became the nursery painted in soft yellows, and the other was our master bedroom. It had a small galley kitchen and a shared bathroom. Nothing fancy or superfluous, but it was our sanctuary. It was a home free from toxic memories and golden cages. I began working part-time remotely. My company was incredibly supportive, allowing me to work from home, creating reports and checking documentation, which meant I could be with my daughter while still contributing to our savings. Jackson was promoted at his engineering firm and was now leading an entire department. His salary increased, but we continued to live modestly, putting money aside every single month for our future. "We are saving for a down payment," Jackson would say as he scrolled through real estate listings on his phone. "Just another year or maybe 18 months, and we can qualify for a mortgage." My parents helped wherever they could. My mother came over several times a week to watch Sophia while I locked myself in the bedroom to work. My father brought over groceries, fixed leaky faucets, and spent hours playing on the floor with his granddaughter. Their support was priceless. We tried not to talk about Jacqueline, but sometimes it was unavoidable. Her sister Christina kept calling Jackson, demanding that he visit his mother in prison. She would say things like, "She is your mother, Jackson. How can you leave her in a place like that?" Jackson would take a deep breath and reply firmly, "Aunt Christina, Mom chose her own path. I am not obligated to pay for her crimes." But Christina would argue that she was suffering and had lost everything. She would say Jacqueline lost what she acquired dishonestly and she almost hurt my pregnant wife. Jackson would counter, "I am sorry, but I have made my choice." After those calls, Jackson would be depressed for the entire evening. I could see how hard it was for him to mourn the mother he wished he had, but he remained steadfast, and I was so proud of him. Jacqueline's assets were eventually auctioned off by the government. The massive villa was purchased by a couple of tech entrepreneurs. The luxury cars were bought by a collector. The antiques, the paintings, the custom furniture, everything went under the hammer. The money flowed directly to the state to pay off her debts and fines. Her chain of beauty clinics was sold to a corporate competitor who immediately renamed them and changed the entire concept. There was not a single trace left of the Stewart empire. Sophia turned 1-year-old and we threw a modest party in our apartment. Only our closest circle was there. My parents, 2 of Jackson's college friends with their wives, and my childhood best friend. We baked a vanilla cake and filled the living room with balloons. We gave our little girl educational toys and clothes. Sophia laughed and clapped her hands, trying to blow out the single candle on her cake with messy cheeks. "Look what a beauty she has become," my mother said, kissing her granddaughter. "Our smart girl." Jackson hugged me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We made it," he whispered. "We made it." I agreed, but deep down, I knew it wasn't completely over. Jacqueline was scheduled for a parole hearing soon. What then? Would she try to crawl back into our lives? The answer came sooner than I expected. About 18 months after the trial, when Sophia was a 1.5 years old, Christina called us again. Her voice was shrill. "Jackson, your mother is being released on parole next week due to overcrowding and good behavior. She needs a place to stay." There was a heavy silence on the line. Jackson gripped the phone so hard I thought the screen might crack. "And what do you suggest?" he asked coldly. "She cannot go back to her house because it was sold. She has no money for rent. Jackson, she is your mother. You have to take her in." "No," he said firmly. "What do you mean, no?" Christina shrieked. "You are throwing your own mother on the street. She can live with you or with other relatives, but not with us. That is my final decision." Christina yelled into the receiver for a long time, but Jackson simply hung up. "Are you sure?" I asked him gently. He looked at me and then at Sophia, who was building a tower with wooden blocks on the rug. "Absolutely," he said. "I will not let her into our daughter's life. I do not want Sophia growing up under that toxic influence. Mom has never apologized. She has never admitted her guilt. She still thinks she is the victim, and people like that do not change." For a week, we lived in tension, expecting Jacqueline to try and contact us, but the phone remained silent. And then I saw her. Sophia and I were walking in a park not far from our apartment complex. It was a beautiful autumn day with golden leaves crunching under our feet and a warm sun overhead. My toddler was running along the path collecting acorns and laughing. I was walking right beside her, holding her hand when I suddenly saw a familiar figure sitting on a park bench. It was Jacqueline. She looked completely different. She had aged 10 years. She was hunched over wearing a cheap department store jacket and faded jeans. Her hair was cut short and gray, and deep wrinkles cut across her face. There was nothing left of the majestic, well-groomed socialite. Our eyes met. She stood up from the bench and took a step toward us. "Jennifer," she rasped. I stopped dead in my tracks and instinctively pulled Sophia behind my legs. My daughter hid her face in my skirt, sensing my sudden spike of fear. "Mrs. Stewart," I said coldly. She looked at Sophia with greed and pain in her eyes. "Is that my granddaughter?" "This is my daughter," I corrected. "Jackson does not want to see you. He won't pick up the phone. I tried to come to your building, but the doorman wouldn't let me in. He made the right decision, I said. Jacqueline took another step closer. Please, I just want to see her. She is my blood. You forfeited the right to call her that the moment you hit me while I was pregnant and cursed my child. Her face twisted in ugly distortion. I was angry. She spat. I wasn't thinking. You were thinking. I shot back. You always think everything through. You wanted to cause me pain, and you did. But now the consequences have caught up with you, and that is justice. Justice. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch. Is it justice that I have lost everything? My house, my business, my reputation? That I spent a year in hell where I was treated like a common criminal? You were a criminal, I said calmly. You broke the law for years. This is all because of you, she shouted, causing passers-by to turn and stare. All because of you. If it hadn't been for you, Jackson would have married a normal girl. He would have had a good life. Sophia was startled by the shouting and began to cry. I picked her up and pressed her against my chest. Mrs. Stewart, step away from us. Or what? Are you going to run to the police again? Are you going to destroy my life again? I will protect my daughter by any means necessary. If you do not leave right now, I will absolutely call the police. She looked at me for a long time, filled with pure hatred and desperation. Then she turned abruptly and walked away, hunched and shuffling in her cheap shoes. I stood there soothing my crying baby and felt my hands shaking. That wasn't a victory. It was just a sad necessity. That evening, I told Jackson about the meeting. He went pale. She tracked us down, he said quietly. Then it is serious. What do you want to do? I asked. He was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the streetlights. I have to meet her one last time to draw a final line in the sand. The meeting was set for 3 days later at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground. Jackson insisted I come with him. We left Sophia with my parents. Jacqueline was already sitting at a table when we arrived. A cup of cold coffee sat untouched before her. She looked up as we entered, and I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jackson, my son, she breathed. We sat opposite her. Jackson was rigid, his hands balled into fists under the table. Mom, we are here to talk for the last time. The last time her voice cracked. Jackson, I am your mother. You can't just cross me out of your life. You crossed yourself out when you hit my pregnant wife, when you humiliated her for years, and when you broke the law. I made mistakes, she pleaded, reaching her hand across the table, trying to touch his fingers, but he pulled back as if burned. I was blind. I didn't want to lose you. You are my only son, my life, and to keep me. You chose control instead of love. You chose honesty, or rather, the lack of it. I chose the person who doesn't play games, who doesn't manipulate, and who doesn't lie. Jacqueline looked at me with venom. You turned him against me. No, I answered calmly. You turned him against yourself through your own actions. I have nowhere to live. Her voice turned into a whine. I have no money. All my assets were seized. I am living with Christina in a studio apartment, sleeping on a fold-out cot. Jackson, help me. You are my son. I will help you, he said firmly. I will transfer $10, zeros and dollars to you. That is for your first few months of rent and living expenses. After that, you must take care of your own life. But do not expect me to invite you into ours. But the grandchild. I want to see the granddaughter. She is my blood. No. Jackson shook his head. Sophia will not know you. I do not want her to grow up under your influence. I do not want her to see how you treat her mother. I do not want you to poison her childhood with your complexes and manipulation. Jacqueline turned chalk white. You are depriving me of my grandchild. You deprived yourself of her. The moment you punched my pregnant wife in the stomach and wished for my child to be a miscarriage. Do you remember those words, Mom? I remember them. They are burned into my memory, and I will never forgive you for that. I was angry, she sobbed. I wasn't in control. An adult is responsible for their words and actions. You were always a master of control. You tried to control my whole life. But now for the first time I have the control and I choose my family. I choose my wife and my daughter. You will remain in the past forever. Jacqueline covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, but I felt no pity. She was weeping over the loss of control and the loss of power, not for the pain she had caused. Mom, I will transfer the $10,000 today. Jackson stood up. That is enough for a start. Find a job. Rebuild your life, but do it without us. Goodbye. He took my hand and we walked toward the exit. Jacqueline called out after us. Jackson, my son, please. But he didn't turn around. We stepped out onto the busy street and he hugged me tight. It's over, his voice was hoarse. I am free. We are free, I corrected him. He kissed my forehead. Thank you for being stronger than me, for protecting us both. Another year passed. Sophia had grown into a real little personality. She was talkative, funny, and curious. She loved picture books, painting with watercolors, and dancing to music on the radio. We enrolled her in a local preschool where she could interact with other kids. Jackson received another promotion to deputy director of his firm. The salary increase was significant. We kept saving, living simply, but we could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. I returned to the office part-time while Sophia went to preschool in the mornings, which was good for her. She became more social and made her first little friends. My parents were overjoyed to watch their granddaughter grow. My father taught her to count to 10, and my mother read her bedtime stories. We met often on weekends and holidays, our small, strong family unit. We heard nothing more from Jacqueline. Christina stopped calling after the meeting at the coffee shop. Sometimes I wondered how my mother-in-law was doing, but those were fleeting thoughts without regret. 6 months later, we finally had enough saved for a down payment and began looking for a home. We looked at dozens of options. Either the neighborhood wasn't right, the layout was weird, or the price was just too high. And finally we found it, a 2-bedroom condo in a new development on the edge of the city. It wasn't elite or in the center, but it was bright, warm, and had great infrastructure nearby like schools and parks. We took out a mortgage. The interest rate was a bit high, but we knew we could manage it. We signed the contract and got the keys. The day we moved into that new apartment was one of the happiest of my life. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the naked walls and the empty space, and breathed in the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. But it was ours, and we had earned it honestly without owing a single soul a dime or a favor. Mom, look, this is our home. Sophia screamed with delight as she sprinted through the empty living room, her voice bouncing off the freshly primed walls in a happy echo that sounded like music to my ears. Yes, baby, it is our home. I whispered more to myself than to her. Jackson wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder, and I could feel the tension that he had carried for years finally leaving his body. We did it, Jen, he murmured into my hair. We actually did it. We spent the next few months renovating the place ourselves, working late into the night and spending every weekend covered in dust and paint. We stripped wallpaper until our fingers ached and assembled flat-pack furniture until we were cross-eyed. But it was a good kind of tired, satisfying exhaustion that comes from building your own future with your own 2 hands. My parents were incredible through it all. My dad, Lincoln, spent hours on his knees installing crown molding with meticulous care, while my mom, Caroline, sat by the window sewing custom curtains because we refused to spend money on expensive blinds. We bought simple, functional furniture, skipping the designer brands Jacqueline used to obsess over because all we cared about was comfort and the fact that we paid for it ourselves. 3 months later, the smell of sawdust was gone, replaced by the scent of roasted chicken and fresh laundry. We threw a housewarming party, inviting colleagues, neighbors, and friends, filling our modest dining room with laughter and noise. It wasn't a gala or a black tie event, but the table was groaning under the weight of homemade potato salad, roasted vegetables, and platters of fruit. Sophia felt so important helping me set out the plates, her little face glowing with pride. Jackson tapped his fork against his glass, and a hush fell over the room. To our home, he said, raising his drink, his eyes locking with mine. To our family, and to the fact that we faced the storm and came out stronger on the other side. As we clinked glasses, I looked at him, then at our daughter, and finally at our cozy condo, and I felt a wave of absolute pure happiness that money could never buy. 2 more years drifted by in a blur of peace and stability. Sophia turned 5 and started kindergarten. She was a bright, curious child who learned to read and paint faster than the other kids. and her teachers were always telling us how quickly she absorbed everything. We kept our heads down and worked hard, paying off our mortgage bit by bit, living a life that wasn't wealthy by society's standards, but was rich in stability. We saved up enough for one good vacation a year, usually renting a small shingled cottage down on the coast for 2 weeks. Sophia was obsessed with the ocean, and she could spend hours building elaborate sand castles and collecting jagged pieces of sea glass. Jackson was thriving too. He was promoted to director of the planning office at his firm, and his career was skyrocketing. The best part was knowing that this success was entirely his doing. It wasn't because of his mother's connections or the family name. It was the result of his talent, his late nights, and his perseverance. I was promoted to manage a department at my company, and as our salaries increased, we started making double payments on the mortgage, determined to own our freedom completely. One afternoon, while we were pushing Sophia on the swings at the park, she suddenly stopped and looked at me with those inquisitive eyes. "Mama, why don't I have a grandma on Daddy's side?" she asked innocently. Her friend Masha at school has 2 grandmas. I froze and looked at Jackson, knowing this day would eventually come. Jackson knelt down, so he was eye level with her, and spoke with a gentle honesty. "Daddy did have a mommy," he said carefully. "But she wasn't a very nice person. She hurt Mommy very badly, and we decided it was safer if she wasn't part of our family." Sophia frowned, trying to process this. "Is she bad?" she asked. "She did bad things," Jackson admitted, "and she didn't want to say sorry." Sophia thought for a second and then shrugged. "Okay. Well, I have Grandma Caroline and Grandpa Lincoln, and they are nice." "Yes, baby." "They love you very much," I said, smoothing her hair. She yelled that she loved them too and ran off to the slide. The heavy question already forgotten in the way only children can do. Jackson took my hand and squeezed it tight. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked, his voice low, watching her run, keeping her from knowing her grandmother. "We didn't keep her away," I said firmly. "Your mother removed herself from her granddaughter's life by her choices. And yes, we did the right thing. Sophia is growing up in a house full of love without toxicity or humiliation. Isn't that what matters?" He nodded slowly as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. It was so quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of our past. "You know," I said softly, "when I first met your mother, she looked at me like I was dirt under her fingernail. She told me I wasn't worthy of you, that I had no future, and that our children would be failures." I gestured to the park, the sunset, and our happy daughter. "Look at us now. We have our own home, good jobs, and a wonderful child. We are happy." And she lost everything because she worshipped status. "It's karma," Jackson said with a sad smile. "It's not magic," I corrected him. "It's consequences. Jacqueline chose control and money. We chose dignity and love, and this is the result." He kissed the top of my head and whispered, "I am so proud of you, Jen. You are the strongest woman I know." I shook my head, leaning into him. "I'm not strong. I just refuse to let anyone make me a victim." That night, after tucking Sophia in Jackson, and I sat on our balcony wrapped in blankets, drinking tea, and watching the city lights flicker on, we talked about the future, about getting Sophia a good education. Not necessarily an elite one, just a solid one that would give her options. "But more than that," Jackson said, staring into his mug, "I want to teach her that character matters more than a bank account." We sat in companionable silence for a while before he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found those documents, if you hadn't gone to the police. Mom would have kept poisoning our lives. I would have been torn apart trying to please everyone, and Sophia would have grown up thinking screaming was normal." "Do you regret what I did?" I asked. "No," he said, turning to me with intense eyes. "I am grateful you were brave enough to break the cycle. I couldn't do it. I was terrified of her my whole life, but you saved us." Time continued to march on. Sophia grew into a competent, kind-hearted girl who loved math and literature. We paid off our mortgage 10 years early, celebrating by popping a bottle of champagne on the roof of our building under the stars. This is our castle. I laughed, tipsy on freedom. It's the best castle in the world, Jackson agreed. We heard from Christina Cook only once in all those years she called to tell us that Jacqueline had moved to another state and was working the front desk at a small beauty salon, living in a rented room in a boarding house. The mighty Jacqueline Stewart reduced to nothing. She asked about you. Christina had said she asked about the granddaughter. Tell her we are happy, Jackson had replied, and tell her I have no regrets. We never heard from that side of the family again. One evening when Sophia was a teenager, we were sitting around the dinner table eating meatloaf and laughing about something that happened at her school. It was such a mundane, ordinary American evening, but it hit me suddenly that this was what victory looked like. It wasn't yachts or galas. It was the safety of a warm kitchen and the sound of my family laughing. Later that night, Sophia asked about Jacqueline again, this time with more maturity. "Mom, what really happened to her?" she asked. So, I told her the truth. Not the graphic details, but the reality that her grandmother was cruel, that she had broken the law, and that we chose peace over blood. Sophia listened quietly, and then nodded. "I get it," she said simply. "Thanks for protecting us." Now, years later, I sit on the balcony with Jackson, watching our daughter walk down the street with her friends. We are just a normal family, neither rich nor poor, but genuinely happy. You know, I say to my husband, "Your mother wanted you to marry Sams so you could have a big mansion and high society connections. And what did you get instead?" He doesn't hesitate. "I got love," he says, taking my hand. "I got a home we built ourselves and a daughter who knows her own worth." "Do you regret it?" I ask him one last time. Not for a single second. We saved each other. We walked through the fire together and built a life we don't have to apologize for. Somewhere out there, Jacqueline sits alone in a rented room, paying the price for a lifetime of greed, while we sit here in the warmth of the life we earned. Justice isn't always a gavel banging in a courtroom. Sometimes it's just living well and being happy. Sophia waves up at us from the sidewalk, her laugh carrying on the breeze. And I know with absolute certainty that we won. This isn't a fairy tale. It is real human justice. Where toxicity is left behind and dignity is the ultimate reward. And that is the best ending I could ever imagine.